Yeah, I'd rather be here early than be here late, I'll tell you.
Yes. And Flavia, will it only show our videos when we're the featured speakers?
Probably when we share our screen, if you want to stop the video, you are not going to see your face. So it's going to stop the video.
Okay.
So we are ready on air. I'm waiting for the interpreter.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us for today's presentation on in-home supportive services and waiver personal care services. My name is Nick Levenhagen. I'm litigation counsel with Disability Rights California on our healthcare and HCBS team. I will be monitoring the question and answer section during the presentation today. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A feature and I'll do my best to answer your question or save it for the end to discuss with our two wonderful speakers today, Denise Miller and Crystal Padilla. And I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves, starting with Denise.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Denise Miller. I'm a senior attorney with Disability Rights California. I'll pass it to Crystal.
Thank you, Denise. My name is Crystal Padilla, and I'm a senior advocate specialist with DRC's Health, Home, and Community-Based Services Practice Group. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So we've just got a couple sections on access and interpretation before we get started. So to access interpretation via your computer, first you'd go to your meeting webinar controls and click interpretation. And then click the language that you would like to hear. And optional to only hear the interpreted language, click mute original audio.
Sorry, Nicholas, for interrupt. I believe our interpreter is arriving, but I can say it in Spanish and then put it also in Spanish for if we have some Spanish-speaking families. Para aquellas familias que necesiten interpretación, la intérprete está llegando. Yo les voy a dejar las instrucciones en el chat, pero recuerden que para acceder a través de su computadora pueden hacer clic en el control de seminarios web, haga clic en interpretación, haga luego en el idioma que desea escuchar en español. Gracias. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to put the instructions also in the chat for those families that need.
Perfect, thank you. And then one other slide, to access interpretation via your mobile phone, you go to your meeting controls and then tap the ... more. Tap language interpretation. Tap the language you'd like to hear. You can also mute original audio and then click done.
I'm going to say it in Spanish. Yvonne, thank you so much. I'm going to give you access. So Yvonne, I'm going to read, and then I'm going to give you access as an interpreter. Si ustedes necesitan acceder a interpretación en su teléfono móvil, por favor, en el control de seminarios web, haga clic en los 3 puntitos, luego haga clic en interpretación, y por último, elija el idioma que desea escuchar, en este caso en español. Opcional es que ustedes pueden, solo si lo desean, escuchar el lenguaje interpretado, haga clic en silenciar el audio original y haga clic en hecho o done. Now I'm going to open the interpretation services and assign Yvonne as the interpreter. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again. And on to today's presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A section rather than the chat. If you do use the chat, I might just move it over to the Q&A section. And for certain questions, I'll save those to the end to discuss with our 2 speakers today. So I'll turn it over to Denise and Crystal.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, so just to let folks know, the following presentation is meant for education only and does not constitute legal advice or counsel. Your situation might be unique and require careful condition. Also, please keep in mind that the information in these slides could become out of date as the laws and local practices relating to these matters are constantly developing. Next slide, please. In today's presentation, we will give you information about the IHSS program, who is eligible, how to apply for IHSS, knowing when an IHSS application is complete, what kind of IHSS services are provided, your right to dispute an IHSS decision, prepare for a hearing, and new IHSS program changes. We will also discuss the Waiver Personal Care Services program, who is eligible, how to apply for Waiver Personal Care Services, what kind of services are provided, and how to dispute decisions and prepare for hearing. At the end of each program section, we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions. Next slide, please. IHSS is a statewide Medi-Cal program that helps people with disabilities live safely in their home. IHSS pays for help with certain tasks for people who cannot do those tasks or need prompting to do those tasks in order to live independently. The task a person gets help with at home are normally referred to as activities of daily living. The IHSS program is also an alternative to out-of-home placement because it helps people live at home instead of living in an institution. Finally, IHSS is administered by the State Department of Social Services, but is run by the counties. Next slide, please. California residents are IHSS eligible if they are blind, disabled, or age 65 or older, receive SSI, SSP, or Medi-Cal, are living in a home or apartment or in an alternative living arrangement, which I will discuss later. You cannot get IHSS while living in a hospital, nursing home, or assisted living or licensed care facility. And you can get IHSS if you cannot live safely at home without help. You can also get IHSS if you are living in an institution and want to live in your own home. You can get IHSS, you can live safe. You can also get IHSS if you can safely live at home, if you get IHSS services and have a need for IHSS services, and IHSS services can begin once you get home. Individuals who are eligible for Medi-Cal can also get IHSS regardless of immigration status. For more information about this, you can see CDSS All County Letter Number 22-44. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, in order to get IHSS, you have to be living in your own home. This includes living in an alternative living arrangement. An alternative living arrangement is a place that is not a traditional home or apartment. For example, you are considered to be living in your own home if you live in an RV, temporary shelter, transitional housing, a homeless shelter, or you live in the home of a family member or friend. If you live in one of these alternative living situations, in order to get IHSS, you must be there for a long enough period of time for the county to assess your need for IHSS and for you to get IHSS services in a safe manner. For more information, you can see CDSS All County Information Notice I-19-20. Next slide, please. You can apply for IHSS by contacting your local IHSS office by phone. You can also download an IHSS application, SOC 295 form, and mail it into your local IHSS office. You can Google search CESS IHSS SOC 295 form, and a link to the IHSS application should appear. We also have provided a link where you can get contact information for your local county IHSS office. Some local county IHSS offices will provide a link to the application online as well. When you apply for IHSS, you will also need to submit a healthcare certification SOC 873 form completed by your doctor. The healthcare certification form asks your doctor to provide information about your need for IHSS and whether or not you're at risk of institutionalization or out-of-home placement without IHSS services. This form can also be found online. You can also Google search CDSS IHSS SOC 873 form, and a link to the form should appear. After you apply, IHSS is required to conduct what is called an in-home assessment as part of the application process. It is a good idea to begin to prepare for your in-home assessment by documenting your functional limitations and areas in which IHSS will assess and rank your functioning. Examples of areas where your functioning will be assessed and ranked include things like breathing, bathing, dressing, walking, transfers, eating, memory, orientation, and judgment. It is also a good idea for you to track how much time you need to get help with IHSS tasks. This is because IHSS can give you the time you need for the completion of each task you need help with due to your functional limitations. During your in-home assessment, it will be your job to help the IHSS worker understand what IHSS tasks you need help with and how much time you need to get the help. You must also present credible evidence about how much time you need to get help with each IHSS task. In other words, you must have believable documentation about the time you need to get help with IHSS tasks. Credible documentation can include an IHSS self-assessment documenting how much time you need to get help with IHSS tasks, and information from your doctor about your functional limitations. At the end of this slide, we have provided a link to DRC's IHSS self-assessment guide, which has forms that you can use to document your functioning in areas where IHSS will rank your functioning and to track the time you need to get help with tasks IHSS pays for. Next slide, please. Your IHSS application will be complete once your IHSS worker verifies that you're eligible for Medi-Cal, completes your in-home assessment, collects information about your need for IHSS, like information about your functional limitations and time you need to get help with IHSS tasks, and sends you a notice of action, either approving or denying your IHSS application. Each IHSS notice of action will have information about what services and hours you will get each month, when IHSS services will begin or change, what IHSS rules were used in making a decision about your eligibility for IHSS services, and information about how to appeal if you disagree with IHSS decision. If you get Medi-Cal and do not need a disability determination, IHSS has 30 days to process your application. If you do not get Medi-Cal and need a disability determination, your application may take longer to process. After getting your IHSS notice of action, you have 90 days to ask for a hearing. Asking for a hearing is how you dispute the county's decision about what services you can receive. Next slide, please. IHSS will pay for certain services, such as domestic services, related services, and personal care services, which we will review in detail in the next couple slides. Accompaniment to medical appointments and places where you can get IHSS services for free, paramedical services, time-limited services, and protective supervision. Next slide, please. Domestic services include things like sweeping, vacuuming, washing and waxing off floor surfaces, washing kitchen counters and sinks, cleaning the bathroom, storing food and supplies, taking out the garbage, dusting and picking up around the house, cleaning your oven and stove, cleaning and defrosting your refrigerator, bringing in fuel for heating and cooking purposes from a fuel bin in the yard, and things like changing bed linen. Next slide, please. Personal care services include things like feeding, bathing, grooming, bowel and bladder care, dressing, transfers. This means getting in and out of bed or on and off seats, etc. Oral hygiene, ambulation. Ambulation is help with walking and getting in and out of cars. Help with prosthesis, such as leg braces, visual or hearing aids, and artificial limbs. Help with medications, respiration, menstrual care, and rubbing skin. Next slide, please. Related services include meal preparation and meal cleanup, laundry, grocery shopping, other shopping and errands like picking up prescription, buying clothes, or toiletries. Next slide, please. Time-limited services include heavy cleaning, removing yard hazards, shoveling ice or snow, and teaching demonstration. Teaching demonstration is eliminating the need for an IHSS service by teaching an IHSS recipient to do the task. Next slide, please. The IHSS hours you will get will be based on your functional limitations and the IHSS hours task guidelines. The IHSS hourly task guidelines is a tool used by the county to determine how many hours you need based on your functional limitations. It is only a tool, and you can get the time you need to receive IHSS services as long as the IHSS worker documents why more time is needed in your IHSS file. In general, The idea is the more functionally limited you are, the more time you need to get help with IHSS tasks IHSS will pay for. The county will do this by first assessing your functional limitations in certain areas. For example, limitations in the area of respiration, that is your ability to breathe, bathing, dressing, walking, transfers, eating, memory, orientation, and judgment. The county will rank your functional limitations from 1 to 5. 1 is for someone who does not have functional limitation and does not need IHSS to complete a task. A rank of 5, which is when functioning is most severe or limited, is for someone who cannot perform a function with or without human assistance. A rank of 6 is used for someone who is eligible for paramedical services. Then the county will look at the hourly task guidelines to get an idea of how long it takes to be provided help with an IHSS task. If you need more time than what the IHSS hourly task guidelines suggest, then IHSS must give you the time you need to get the service and document why you need more time in your IHSS file. For example, you may need more time to get help because of stiffness or severe spasticity or tremors in muscles or even combative behaviors, which causes a need for more time to complete an IHSS service. IHSS will also prorate certain services to make sure that you only get the time for services to be provided to you and not others in your household. Finally, IHSS will look to see if you are getting free IHSS services from another person, place, or entity. This is called an alternative resource. Proration and alternative resources can reduce the amount of time you can get for IHSS services. Next slide, please. For children, the need for IHSS is based on disability, not on age. For example, most children can breathe on their own. A child with a disability that causes functional limitations in breathing may need IHSS to assist with using a breathing machine. Most children can also be expected to walk by 5 years of age. A child that is 5 years old that needs IHSS to receive help with walking may have a disability that causes functional limitations in walking. At the bottom of this slide, we have provided a link to CDSS IHSS Social Worker Manual 102, which will provide more information about this process and other tools used by IHSS to evaluate functional limitations in children. Next slide, please. The most used tool in evaluating children's functional limitations is the Age-Appropriate Guidelines tool. This tool lists a child's age and what level of functioning the child should be at based on age. For example, the chart shows that in the area of dressing, children cannot be expected to dress themselves independently until they reach the age of 5. At 5, if a child has a disability-related functional limitation that prevents dressing independently, then time can be provided for dressing. This chart uses a rank of 1 to indicate that there is no need for IHSS services or eligibility for an IHSS service because all children need help in that task area. The chart is only a guideline. The county must complete an individual assessment of a disabled child's need for services, and exceptions may be made on a case-by-case basis for special circumstances. Next slide, please. A child with disabilities can get the following services: related services, personal care services, paramedical services, protective supervision, assistance with travel to and from an approved place. Next slide, please. Next, we will talk about protective supervision. Protective supervision consists of watching someone to prevent the person from doing unsafe things and accidentally hurting themselves. An IHSS recipient can get protective supervision if the individual has a mental impairment or illness, is non-self-directing. This means the person cannot assess danger and the risk of harm, and as a result will engage in dangerous activities that may cause self-harm. Has a physical ability to engage in dangerous behaviors. For example, if an IHSS recipient is unable to move independently and cannot self-harm, then protective supervision will not be provided. However, if a recipient who cannot get out of bed or in a wheelchair and can still self-harm, that person should be evaluated for protective supervision. And finally, the person needs to be watched 24 hours a day to prevent self-injury, hazard, or accident because the behaviors are unpredictable. Children under 18 years of age may get protective supervision services if they meet all of the above requirements and the child needs more supervision than another child of the same age without a disability. For example, a child who cannot be safe with routine childcare because of a need to be constantly watched and provided with redirection to avoid injury. At the bottom of this slide, you will see a reference to IHSS Rules 30-757.17 through .172, All County Letter 15-25, and a link to that ACL. Next slide, please. Examples of behaviors that may show a need for protective supervision include things like wandering from home and getting lost, eating non-food items, wandering into the street without checking for cars, attempting tasks beyond his, her, their physical and or mental capability, and not understanding the risks of injury, trying to move furniture or heavy objects, climbing onto the counter, turning on the stove and forgetting to turn it off, self-biting and scratching, lack of stranger danger awareness. In order to get protective supervision, an SOC 821 form will need to be completed by the IHSS recipient's doctor and submitted to IHSS. We have provided a link to the form below. Next slide, please. Individuals cannot get protective supervision for friendly visiting or social activities, when the need is caused by a medical condition and the form of supervision required is medical. For example, a person with diabetes needs supervision in case they become hypoglycemic. In anticipation of a medical emergency, for example, a person with congestive heart failure and need for protective supervision is in anticipation of a heart attack. To prevent or control antisocial or aggressive behavior. For example, they get into fights and destroys property. To guard against deliberate self-destructive behavior. So this means when a person knowingly intends to harm himself or herself. Just as a reminder, if the person does not know that they may self-harm, they may be eligible for protective supervision. You can find these IHSS rules in MPP 30-757.172A through E. We have provided a link to those rules below. Next slide, please. Paramedical services are ordered by a licensed medical professional and provided under his or her direction. Examples of paramedical services include administering medications or giving injections, range of motion exercises, pressure sore or wound care, catheter insertion, bowel program, enemas insertion of suppositories, tube feeding, tracheostomy care, and suctioning. In order to get paramedical services, you must obtain an SOC 321 form completed and signed by your medical provider, like your doctor. You can get the form from the link provided below. Next slide, please. To be eligible for paramedical services, you must be unable to perform the paramedical service at all, and the paramedical services is necessary to maintain the person's health, and the paramedical service requires training and judgment to perform. For example, puncturing skin, inserting a medical device into a body orifice. Okay, thank you so much. And now I'll hand things off to Denise.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. We got the slide up. Okay, so first I'd like to share a really exciting update IHSS program, which is that beginning February 19th, 2024, about 2 months ago, there are no longer any provider eligibility requirements for minor recipients in most IHSS programs. And those programs include the Community First Choice Option, or CFCO, the IHSS Plus Option, or IPO, and the IHSS Residual, or IHSS-R program. This change means that minor recipients in these programs have the right to select a provider of their choice, including parent providers. Prior to these changes, parents could only be paid providers if there was no other suitable provider available and the parents were prevented from full-time employment due to the care needs of the child. And a non-parent provider could only be hired if parents were not able or available to care for the minor child, among other eligibility requirements. These parent-provider rules created a lot of barriers to children accessing the program, and so thankfully they no longer apply. However, there does remain a carve-out for minor recipients in the PCSP program. Minors in this program can only hire a non-parent provider, and this is because PCSP rules must follow federal law and don't allow the hiring of non-parent providers. And if you're not sure which IHSS program your child may be in, you can contact your IHSS social worker. If your child is in the PCSP program and you want them to have a parent provider, counties should transfer these individuals, but you can also request a program transfer. And switching IHSS programs shouldn't result in a change to the number of authorized hours you receive, but you should make sure to speak with the county about any program changes to ensure that your hours won't be impacted if you change programs. It's also important to note that all providers must still complete the provider enrollment process, including any background checks, and also must have authorization to work in the United States. Next slide, please. IHSS providers for minors can only get reimbursed for the following services, and these include related services, which again, as Crystal mentioned, are meal prep or cleanup, laundry, grocery shopping, or other errands, personal care services, medical accompaniment, protective supervision, and paramedical services. So a provider for a minor cannot be paid to provide domestic services or heavy cleaning, yard hazard abatement, and teaching and demonstration. If you have a minor child, which is defined as someone under age 18, in the CFCO, IPO, or IHSSR programs, and their hours were reduced because of the previous parent-provider rules, you have two options. Counties are supposed to recalculate your minor child's authorized hours by their next scheduled reassessment, or you can call the county office and ask them to update your child's authorized hours before their next reassessment. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to transition now to discussing IHSS notices of action, appeals, and hearings. The county must send adequate notice in the form of a notice of action, or otherwise called an NOA, to tell a recipient when there's a change in their IHSS services. And there are three main different types of notices in the IHSS program. The first is when an application is approved. And this should have the effective date and the number of hours authorized per task. The second type of notice is when an application is denied. And this notice should have the bases for the decision and the regulations supporting the action. And the third type of notice is for when services are reduced, terminated, or altered. This notice should be received at least 10 days before the effective date. And we've put the rule for that there. That is MPP section 20-001A1. This notice should also include the reason for any change and regulations supporting the action, as well as any difference from the previous authorized hours. It's also important to note that the notice of action must be written in the primary language of the recipient. If the county can't provide a notice of action written in the claimant's primary language, the county must offer and provide interpretation services. And if you disagree with any notice, you have the right to challenge a county's decision by filing an administrative appeal. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Next slide, please. In appealing any notice of action, you must be aware of appeal deadlines, and these will also be written on the notice of action. Importantly, if you're already receiving IHSS benefits, you have the right to request what's called aid paid pending, meaning the benefits will not change until there's a hearing or a decision is issued. What's really important is that you must request aid paid pending before the effective date of the change. And the effective date is different than the notice date. The effective date should be listed on the notice of action as well. If the hearing request is filed after the effective date, then the claimant won't have the opportunity to continue receiving the same benefits while they wait for a hearing or decision. So that's why it's really important to read the notice carefully and be aware of those dates. Otherwise, an appeal must be filed within 90 calendar days from the date of the notice, and up to 180 days if you can show good cause as to why your appeal is late. Good cause means a substantial or compelling reason beyond the claimant's control and considers the length of the delay, the diligence of the claimant making the request, and any potential prejudice to the other party. The State Hearings Division, a part of the California Department of Social Services, manages the appeals and the requests for hearing, and we've included the website link for CDSS's hearing requests. Next slide, please. This slide contains information on how to request a hearing or an appeal. You have a couple options. The first is that you can fill out the back of the notice and mail it to the address indicated. You also have the option to submit the hearing request online, which is something that we highly recommend. It's a great system that keeps everything in one place that you can go back to see documents you may need, and it keeps everything in writing and accurately tracked on a time. You have two options if you want to file your appeal online. The first is that you can create an ACMS account. ACMS stands for Appeals Case Management System, or you can submit your appeal without creating an account. And we've included that website as well. You also have the option to mail a written letter to the California Department of Social Services State Hearings Division, and we've given that address on this slide. And lastly, you can call the State Hearings Division at 800-743-8255. 8525, and you can request a hearing orally. Next slide, please. So how do you prepare for a hearing? First, after requesting a hearing, you should receive a confirmation notice from the State Hearings Division that your request for hearing was received. Next, you'll receive a hearing notice with the date, time, and location of the hearing. And you should receive this hearing notice at least 10 days before the hearing. If you don't, and you're not ready on that date, you can request a postponement, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. You should also be given contact information for the county appeals worker or appeals specialist. And the appeals specialist represents the county, so they're not a neutral party, and they work to gather information to prepare for the hearing. Oftentimes, the county will contact you to try to resolve any issues before the hearing and without the need to go to hearing. The appeals specialist may also offer what's known as a conditional withdrawal of your hearing request. This means that the claimant withdraws their hearing request on the condition that the county do something to fix the problem, like conducting a reassessment to determine the claimant's IHSS hours of need. Conditional withdrawals must be in writing and must be signed by both parties. If you do agree to a conditional withdrawal, and you don't have to, it's important to be aware of the date and remember to request any benefits retroactive to the date of the action, not just the date of the withdrawal and when it's signed. And this is because you want to make sure you don't lose out on any of the services you're entitled to. I also want to note that sometimes claimants will receive notices of action reinstating benefits while their hearing is happening or pending. This is essentially reflecting that they're continuing to receive aid paid pending while the hearing is going on. You shouldn't assume that this notice means the appeal has been resolved. And if you're unsure about any notice you receive, you should call your county appeal specialist to ask about it, or you can reach out to advocacy organizations like Disability Rights California. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, can you go back, Nick? Thanks. In preparing for your hearing, you have the right to review your IHSS case file. And it can be especially helpful to review within your file your latest needs assessment form, the functional index ranks about what the recipient can and cannot do, any IHSS worker case notes, the hourly task guidelines that they've relied upon, and any medical records or physician reports. Next slide, please. In preparing for your hearing, it can also be extremely helpful to your case to get updated information about any functional limitations. And this can include an updated functional limitations assessment and self-assessment worksheet, detailed doctor's letters that describe how the disability impacts the person's ability to complete tasks without assistance, and explains any changes in condition or varying conditions. And here I would recommend that I think we all know physicians are often very busy and hard to reach. So a lot of times drafting a letter on the physician's behalf can be really helpful, and also providing the physician enough time to review it and get back to you. And at least 2 days before the hearing, you'll receive the county's statement of position. I recommend reading this. It will help you better understand and anticipate the county's questions and why they're justifying the actions that they've taken, and help you prepare any responses before your hearing. You also will have the opportunity to submit your own claimant position statement. And this is totally optional. It does not have to be a formal brief. It can just be in your own words why you feel the recipient needs the hours they need, and gives you the opportunity to present your case and support with credible evidence about why you feel the recipient may need more hours, for example. It can also give you the opportunity to identify other evidence or witnesses that you may need. And going back to postponements, if you can't make the day or time of your hearing, or you aren't prepared to go to hearing on that day, you can request a postponement. And it's important to note that any aid paid pending will continue until the next scheduled hearing date if your postponement is granted. Next slide, please. IHSS hearings are informal, and this means that it's similar to, but not like a real court case where traditional rules of evidence apply and there's strict procedures. However, all testimony is taken under oath and the hearings are recorded. They're led by an administrative law judge who is a neutral party and will decide the case. The administrative law judge will lead the hearing and will ask you to go first. The county will explain why the hours were cut or why more time can't be granted. And then you will have the opportunity to present evidence about your needs and categories where you and the county disagree. And this is also your opportunity to present any testimony by witnesses or doctor's letters that you've been able to obtain, diary logs, or medical records. The evidence must show what you need and why you need the more time, how long it takes to complete a task, and any safety risks that may be present without a higher level of service. And again, it can be helpful to bring witnesses or submit signed statements, even from friends, family, school staff, regional center counselors, or former care providers. All of this evidence can be really helpful to administrative law judges in their decision-making. Next slide, please. After the conclusion of the hearing, a hearing decision will be mailed to you in the county within 90 days, so it often is mailed sooner. And if you disagree with the decision, you have two options. You can file a request for rehearing, which is asking for a new hearing, and you must do this within 30 days after receiving the original hearing decision. And rehearings are discretionary, which means that CDSS will review your request and decide whether or not to grant a new hearing. You also have the option to file what's called a petition for writ of administrative mandamus, or a writ. This request goes to Superior Court and asks the Superior Court to review and reverse the final order. A writ must be filed within 1 year of the date of the decision. And writs can be difficult and a bit complicated to file. So we recommend consulting with an attorney or advocacy organization before proceeding. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to transition now to talking about Waiver Personal Care Services. So Waiver Personal Care Services, or WPCS, are personal care services which can be combined with IHSS services. They're designed to assist waiver participants in remaining safely in their homes and members of their community. And in order to receive WPCS, you must meet a few conditions. The first is that you must be on the HCBA waiver, or the Home and Community-Based Alternatives waiver. The second is that you must already be receiving personal care services through IHSS. And the third is that you have a doctor's order saying that the individual needs WPCS in order to remain safely at home. WPCS hours are determined after your IHSS hours are determined, and WPCS is not meant to replace IHSS and is more flexible than IHSS. Next slide, please. What's really great about WPCS is that it includes an adult companionship component, and this is for individuals who are 18 and older. And this is intended for folks who are isolated or maybe homebound due to medical conditions. It includes non-medical care, supervision, and socialization provided to a waiver participant. And other services that qualify for WPCS hours include things like verbal cueing, monitoring for safety, assisting with self-directed activities and activities of daily living, advising primary caregivers of any problems or concerns, providing information for updating plan of treatments, and more. And WPCS providers can even get paid to provide certain services outside of the healthcare facility setting while a participant is hospitalized for up to 7 days. Next slide, please. Another great component of WPCS is that WPCS providers can include legally responsible relatives or spouses or parents of minor children. WPCS providers must be 18 and older and complete the IHSS provider enrollment process. And in order to be a WPCS provider for somebody that you're legally responsible for, you must show that the minor or the spouse has an extraordinary care need. So for minors, this means that the need for WPCS services is based on a functional impairment due to the minor's disability, and that the type of assistance needed is beyond what would normally be expected for a minor of the same age without that disability or functional impairment. And we've included a link to the Department of Healthcare Services website that discusses parent and spouse providers in the WPCS program. It's also important to note that IHSS overtime rules apply to WPCS as well. And we've linked to a publication from Disability Rights California that explains the overtime rules and any relevant overtime exemptions that you may want to request or be eligible for. So for example, if the provider is approved for an overtime exemption, they would be allowed to work up to 12 hours a day and up to 360 hours a month with IHSS and WPCS hours combined. So this can be a really great benefit to families. And lastly, on this slide, we've included a link to a really great resource from the Department of Healthcare Services, a frequently asked fact sheet regarding WPCS. Next slide, please. On this page, we have a list of resources regarding IHSS and WPCS that include Disability Rights California's online resources. We draft and publish a lot of publications and do our best to keep those updated. So please peruse that if you have the time. Also information about our intake line and how to reach us, the website for IHSS regulations with the California Department of Social Services, as well as the California Department of Social Services website. And before we get to time, any questions that there may be, I'd like to see if Nick Lutton is on the call. He was going to speak a bit about his family's experience with the IHSS program.
I'm texting him.
Okay, thanks. He should be on in just a moment. And I think we will have quite a bit of time for questions if folks have any while we're waiting and that they want to pop into the Q&A.
Yeah, and Denise, this is Nick. I'll just raise, I think, of the questions that were asked, sort of addressing the new rules around parent providers. One person had asked for the provider changes effective February. If the parent still continues to be the provider of choice, do they have to certify anymore that they can't work full time, or they could be working full time now and be the IHSS provider? And my understanding of the rules is that a parent no longer has to certify that they can't work full time under the new rules, but just wanted to share with everyone and see if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Denise,
Okay.
Nick is here.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Nick. Yeah, the floor is yours if you want to talk about your family's experience with the IHSS program.
Absolutely. I apologize for being a little late. I'm bouncing back and forth. As most of you know now, my name is Nick Lutton and I'm with Family Voices of California. But I'm also a dad. My oldest son is 11 years old. He has autism and an intellectual disability. He's a regional center client. He has an IEP, behavior intervention supports, a BIP. We've been to the diagnostic centers. We've been through all the educational aspects, and he also receives 24-hour protective supervision through IHSS. I also have a 3-year-old, well, I'm sorry, he's 4 now, who has autism and is a regional center client as well. And I'm really privileged to be able to talk about IHSS. I've done a lot of webinars throughout my time as an advocate about IHSS and what protective supervision is and why it's important. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of a journey on my family's end and how it has affected our lives for the good and for the worse. And there's a lot of nuances to in-home supportive services. When my son was diagnosed when he was 2.5, we received all the services that you could imagine: early intervention services, speech and language pathology, occupational therapy. Our pediatrician was dead on with everything and helped us walk through. Our regional center service coordinator was fantastic. But we came into a very difficult decision where, because of my son's behaviors, he uses self-injurious behavior, as well as some other things, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Only one of us could work. And that made it really difficult. In fact, we moved from Nevada, where before I did advocacy, all I did was hotel operations in Las Vegas, New York, and in China. And so we left our world to come back to California because of the regional center system and these services that were available. And because he needed to be watched 24 hours, my wife had to quit her job. And that was a big deal. What I tell people, before I had done Family Voices, I worked for a family resource center in the Central Valley called EPU Children's Center, and I would train and take on individual cases with families. One of the hardest things for me and my family was the intake. Not filling out the forms, because we're used to filling out forms as family members, right? I mean, that's what we do. But intake, and that 45-minute to an hour conversation with the social worker from the county that comes in, where you have to explain your entire life to them, is extremely jarring, right? You just don't know what they're going to say. And Disability Rights has unbelievable guides through all of that. But what we found, and it took a lot of soul searching and a lot of humility, was that we needed to be as open and honest as possible. And the problem with that is that it doesn't feel good. It's not fun. And most people and parents feel as though they're talking bad about their children, or that they don't want to disparage their child because their child can do anything. And I agree with that. I hope one day that my child can do a whole bunch of things, but he's severely impacted by his intellectual disability. And so what I tell people is, during those meetings, is that vulnerability is the biggest aspect. How vulnerable are you willing to be? Because if you get 45 minutes to tell someone what your life is like, that's very difficult. And so the more vulnerable you are, the more understanding, or at least more information, that person from the county who's going to make this decision on how many hours you receive, or if you receive the program at all, what they will do. And what I tell people, and what we did, was we wrote down what my son can do and what my son can't do. And we both did that individually, my wife and I. And then we came together, and once we did that and we put those two pieces of paper together, we had a big argument. Because again, my parent brain and her parent brain, right? Well, he can do that. Yes, he can. No, he can't. And we'd go back and forth, right? And that's when it started to unravel. That's when it really started to get to the point where we understood what we needed to say. Because I'm going to give you a very hardcore or a very good example. They'll come in and they will ask me, can your son take a bath by himself? Or can he take a bath? Well, my answer to that is yes. Because every night we take a bath. He takes a bath every night. But what goes into place to get him into the bath, right? My parent brain says to another person who I don't know, who I really don't want to tell my personal life about, yes, he can. But here's what happens when we take a bath. I have to turn the bath on. I have to make sure that it's the right temperature. I have to make sure that he gets undressed properly. I have to make sure that he gets in properly. I have to stay there the entire time. I also have to once I get him out, I have to go ahead and dry him off. And during that whole time, the reason I have to do that is because he'll turn the water on too hot and scald himself. He'll turn it on too cold and freeze himself. He will hold his breath underneath the water until he passes out. He will jump inside of the bath from corner to corner when you can't make it because it's this big, right? And fall down and hurt himself. He will try to get out of the bath and run throughout the house. He cannot dry himself off alone without being distracted. So can he take a bath? No, he can't. But the parent brain in me, when I talk to someone that I don't know, says yes. But all of those things that I have to do, I do every single night. So when you're talking to the provider or the person that comes in from the county, what other aspects of your child's life do you have to take steps to keep their safety in line? And it's hard for us as parents to understand that that's what we do because, again, we don't want to talk down on our child, but that's the reality of it. And that takes me 45 minutes, that entire thing. It's not fun for me as a dad or as a parent to tell all of you that sometimes my son eats out of the garbage. That's not fun. Sometimes my son will try to run out of the house. Sometimes he practices self-injurious behavior. Sometimes we have to watch him while he's using the restroom. And obviously you can think about why. Those aren't fun things to say about my kid. I love my son. But that's the reality of it. And I don't live in the future because people that come in these services are not about the future. They're about right now. What supports and services do you need right now? And if you can say these things out loud to them, not only does it help your case, but it also helps them understand what you're going through. I'd say this with the regional center system as well, talking to your service coordinator, as well as your doctors. Being very open and honest is extremely important. And I love my son. And hopefully when he gets older, and he graduates from high school and he sees all these things, because I do talk about him, it's okay if he doesn't like me. I'm okay with that. Because at the end of the day, my job as his dad and his mother's job is to make sure every service that I know of is available to him. And if at the end of the day he doesn't like me for it, that's okay. Because I can look in the mirror when he's 18 and say, I did everything that I could. Everything that I knew about, I reached out for. And again, those things are not fun to say. They're not, they hurt on a very deep level. But when you're speaking about a program that helps, again, not only keep our household going, but also allows my wife and myself to watch him all the time, it's so important. There are cameras in every single room in our house, including every single bathroom, because we have so many service providers that come in for respite and personal attendance, and it's for his safety. There are 7 locks on every single door in our house because he elopes and he's a flight risk. He will absolutely just get out the door and run. Another example of how, in the beginning, they didn't want to give us protective supervision. They wanted to speak with him and he was 6. And I said, let's have him sit right here, but let's just leave the front door open while we talk. And my wife was outside, but she was down the block and he just ran for it. And she said, aren't you going to go get him? I said, my wife's down the street, but that's what we have to watch out for. So how could we ever rest? And so when service providers come in, we have to let them know when ABA comes in or anyone else, hey, there are cameras in every single room, including the bathroom. If you're uncomfortable with that, that's fine. You don't have to do that, but it's for his safety. In-home supportive services is based off of safety. My child is not safe unless he's watched all the time. He overstuffs his mouth. He'll choke. He'll mess with the microwave. I found him, not for long, but I found him crammed himself into the refrigerator. Don't know how he did it. We were playing, hide and seek and whatnot. And I had to look on the camera. all those things again, I'm going to say it, I'm going to keep saying it. They're not fun and they hurt deeply as a dad. They really, really do. But when you're talking about services like this, especially with something that's so personable, you have to be able to be extremely vulnerable and just live in the reality. And I've found that if you write it down, it makes life a lot easier because even if you don't have a significant other, if you write down what they can and can't do, and then you go ahead and really break down, well, what they can't do, break it down from there. What do you do to help support them? And you'll find out that there's 6 or 7 steps in each one of those things, and all of that equates to hours of care. And that's how not only do you make your case, but at the same time, you convey to someone, we talk about our elevator pitch all the time in project leadership and family voices. How do you tell someone about your life, which is extremely complex and difficult in like 45 seconds to 60 seconds? It's very difficult. And then to have someone who you think might be judgmental in your kitchen asking you about all of these things while they're checking it off. Again, it has to do with vulnerability and it has to be about being real and being realistic. I am 100% for self-determination and making sure that my son has all of the rights that he has and that he wants in the future. But right now, at this very moment, that's not the case. And us as family members and parents and communities, we have to realize that. And we have to be able to, again, humble ourselves and say those things out loud. And culturally, I know that's difficult. I know it's difficult for certain ethnicities. And I know it's definitely difficult for fathers. I know that for a fact. But most of these supports and services that we talk about, not only just IHSS, but all of them have to do with vulnerability. Because as parents with children with disabilities, what do we say when people go, "How you doing?" "I'm okay." And we're not. And it's okay. I've taken hundreds and hundreds of phone calls from people in their driveway before they walk into the house that are just crying because what they're walking into, they understand, and it's very difficult. And some of you have probably been there too. I've been there, and that's okay. But understanding the vulnerability and understanding that these systems don't work unless you tell them exactly what's happening and where your level of comfort is, especially when it comes to this program, because they need to know that your child's safety is on the line. Not their medical care, but their safety. And how do you demonstrate that to them in a 45-minute period? You have to be real with yourself and you have to be brutally honest. And it's going to hurt. But what's worse, being hurt for an hour or a couple of days or being denied services because when they tell you, does your child eat 3 square meals a day and can they prepare their food? And you say, yeah, because you just make them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and that's it, right? Well, it's not just making them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? There's probably a lot more that goes into it. How many times have you had to stick your finger down their throat to make sure they don't choke because they overstuff their mouth? I do. So it's not just making food, right? It's making food and making sure that our children are safe. So again, I appreciate Disability Rights California, which I work with very closely, and asking me to come in. And I'm very thankful that I have a tech team on the back end that's able to do that because this is something that's very dear to my heart. It's allowed our family to be able to continue and allow my son to stay safe. And every year when it renews, it's terrifying. I'm not going to lie. It's terrifying. I always have DRC's number ready to go. I always have the appeal process ready to go. But it's terrifying. And because these supports and services help us live a normal life, at least what's normal to us. And so I just want to thank you all for listening to what it's like on my end. And hopefully you learned a little bit about how to apply and get through your meeting when you have it. And maybe it'll work for you, maybe it doesn't. But I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Nick. This is Nick with Disability Rights California. I think that was really excellent advice for families preparing for an IHSS assessment and a really impactful story. So thank you so much for sharing. There were a few questions in the chat I wanted to go over, but I don't know, Denise or Crystal, if you had anything else you'd like to share before we go over questions.
Yeah, I also just want to say thank you to Nick for sharing that. And I'm so glad to hear that IHSS program is working for your family in the way that's intended and that your son is getting the services he needs. And I also want to say, like, it could just be really difficult and really challenging to get IHSS services for children, especially young children. And I think it's really crucial and vital to push back and fight the biases that exist out there and seek support that you need. It's overwhelming to get a denial or have your hours reduced when you've been getting them for so long. So reach out to Disability Rights California, reach out to other parent advocates. Like, we are there to help.
Hi, this is Crystal. Yeah, thank you, Nick, for that, for sharing. That was really heartfelt, and it makes me think of my family, and the word that you used, frightening, is so real when it comes to that reassessment. So thank you for sharing that.
Okay, so just a couple questions that came up in the chat here. One that came up multiple times, so I thought it'd be best to discuss with the group, was on whether there's any age limits for WPCS services.
No, not that I'm aware of. Like I said, there are those exceptional care needs that you would need to show for minors, as well as spouses, if you would like to be a WPCS provider for a minor child under age 18 or your spouse. And the adult companionship component is only available for folks who are age 18 and older.
Great, thank you. And then one other question. A person said at the beginning, I heard something with legal status. Does that apply to the requirements to filing an IHSS application?
Basically, if an individual is eligible for Medi-Cal, they can get in-home support services regardless of status. So just so folks know, it's not like you have to have a social security number to get in-home support services. I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you. And it looks like there are a couple questions for Nick. And Nick, you marked that you wanted to answer a question live.
I did on accident. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hijack, but I figured I would go through them and answer some of them. Yeah, absolutely. Exploring and investigating my child's environment and his world could absolutely be the cause of his of his self-interest behavior, as well as other things. The problem is that we don't know. My son uses, all of his words are scripted. So if his wants and his needs are utilized through episodes of Jake and the Neverland Pirates or Little Einsteins, he takes all of that and uses echolily. And so if you don't know, a specific Sophia the First episode and what she's feeling or what she looks like or what she's asking for, then you don't know what he's saying. It sounds like he's just scripting a movie to you, where the real genuine talk back and forth doesn't happen. And again, he's been very fortunate that we've, had him receive psychological evaluations. The diagnostic center has looked at him multiple times, and we've had comprehensive ABA therapy for him since he was 3. So, since he was 3, we've had about 6 people in the house every single day to help assist him with not only his with his language, but also his behaviors. which are extremely difficult. I had to be trained in CPI to be able to restrain him correctly when he would get out of control. Again, not something fun to say out loud, right? At a webinar with a whole bunch of people. But it's important that you all know that, because that's the level of severity that my household lives in. And I have no shame telling anyone anymore, because it just is what it is. And it drains me afterwards. But it's for his own protection. And it's for his protection, and because he's getting bigger, my wife's protection and my 4-year-old's protection. So it's not fun, but it is what it is. And it's something that, you know, we have to continue doing. And again, it's those types of answers and those types of questions of what else are you doing and how else are you assisting your child when it comes to in-home supportive services are other things that I've done, my family has done, that shows them the severity of the situation and how this needs to be not only given to us, but given to him, that he needs this service. So I hope that answered the question.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. We had a couple other questions that came in. So one was about the maximum IHSS hours, which is 283 hours per month. The statutory limit is based on monthly. And then you'll get notices that generally break down hours weekly, not necessarily per day. And then there are some programs, if you're considered non-severely impaired, the maximum would be 195 hours per month. So I hope that answers that question. There was somebody wrote, they're trying to figure out who to reach out to. The 16-year-old who is on Medi-Cal, medical team strongly suggested IHSS, and then told that she's not eligible unless she has been designated eligible by Social Security. There's no Social Security designation requirement for IHSS. I don't know if Crystal or Denise, you have any other thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, Nick, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I said 16-year-old daughter on Medi-Cal, has the medical team recommended IHSS, but then they were told they were not eligible unless she has been designated eligible by Social Security. And is that true? And I was saying there's not a requirement to be designated eligible by Social Security for IHSS. I'd encourage you to reach out to your local IHSS office or contact DRC for additional advice and assistance, but I don't know if you had anything else to add.
Yes, thank you for that. So yeah, the only thing I would add is I would say there's two different ways of going about this. The first way would be to, when you call in and you try to apply on the phone, if you're told you're not eligible, you say, okay, can you send me a notice of action telling me that I'm not eligible? Because what that forces the county to do is to process the application the right way. So I'm not sure where this information was received from, but I would go directly to the county's phone number, whatever, with the local county and apply that way. Or I would download an application and mail that into the county. And that way you kind of get past all this stuff you're getting. And then again, if there's a denial, then go ahead and appeal that, and you can, contact DRC for more help and advice.
Thanks, Crystal. And something we hear all too often from callers and you're right. The person who put this in the chat talked about it being very wounding and insulting, is when they're told by the IHSS social worker that it's just their job to care for the minor child. I don't know, Crystal, if you had any advice on dealing with that situation.
Well, so now we know that the parent-provider roles have gone away, so you shouldn't have those kind of reasons for denying IHSS to kids anymore. I mean, we did touch on what services were available to children, and so those services that children can get, they can get now, and anybody can be their provider. So this whole idea of, oh, your child can't get IHSS because that's your job, that really goes to the old parent-provider roles that are no longer in effect. And so I would say, try again. If you're unsuccessful, again, use the appeal process, because you'd be amazed at how many things can be resolved that way. And call DRC.
There was a follow-up on the Social Security question, where I think the answer again is to use the appeal process. The county is refusing to process an application without a Social Security disability designation. If a child is Medi-Cal eligible, there is a requirement for IHSS. It's available for individuals who have a disability, but that doesn't require a Social Security disability designation. So again, I think the answer is to request a notice of action that you can appeal, denying those services if in fact they're refusing to provide IHSS. And I don't know, Crystal or Denise, if you have anything else on that.
Yeah, I would also say that you do have the right to request a state fair hearing. You can call the 800 number that's listed on our slide if the county refuses to issue you that notice to appeal as well. So you can escalate yourself without having a notice of action.
There was a question about a letter of support for IHSS, and they're asking what they should have people include in a letter of support.
So I'm not sure what is meant by letter of support, but as we talked about earlier, individuals get IHSS based on need. In other words, if a person has a functional limitation and needs an IHSS service, you can get the service to assist you with the receipt of the task because of the limitations. And so you can get, for example, a letter from a doctor documenting what your functional limitations are in the areas that IHSS will assess you. And we have forms that you could use online that you can just literally take to your doctor, and there's a bunch of boxes where they're just going to check off what your functional limitations are. And the other thing that you want to be able to do is you want to do the self-assessment. That's not quite a letter of support, but that's, just kind of so that you understand how much time you need. And then finally, if there's certain services that you're trying to get, for example, protective supervision, and, your child is having a lot of dangerous behaviors, and you've had, teachers, regional center, neighbors, any other family members witness self-injurious behaviors that the individual has, and they don't realize that are self-injurious, you can get letters of support for that. So I think it really, it just depends on what you mean and by that.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. We just had another question come in that asks, can a family with a child with severe autism qualify for IHSS? And the answer is yes. IHSS is a Medi-Cal service. So if a child is Medi-Cal eligible, which there's a number of pathways towards Medi-Cal eligibility, and they require IHSS services for any disability, including severe autism, then they are eligible. And we'll just give, oh, go ahead, Crystal.
No, going back to this, I just want to flip back to the Social Security designation. IHSS cannot be denied because of a lack of Social Security number, and I believe there's an all-county letter on that. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but if you call DRC and you speak to somebody in intake, we can get that letter to you or tell you what the number is so that you'll have that and you can provide that to the county. So just because a person doesn't have a Social Security number doesn't mean that, that's going to prevent them from getting IHSS. So I just wanted to go back to that and make sure I was clear about that.
These have been a lot of really great questions that have come in. We'll just give it another minute here to see if anyone else has any questions. Just put it in the Q&A.
I think there's one here, Nick, about protective supervision and paramedical. It says if someone has protective supervision, then how many hours of paramedical can they get? Does it matter? Correct, since they already get max. So that's a big question. So as Nick mentioned earlier, there's different caps on how many hours a person can get of in-home support services. I kind of like to think of it in two different ways. There's a cap that applies to everybody who gets IHSS, which is 283 hours. Nobody can get more than that. That's all that IHSS will provide. But for people who get protective supervision, you can either get 195 if you're non-severely impaired, or 283 if you're severely impaired. And that's not a hard and fast rule because there's some people that get 195 of protective supervision hours. That's just for the protective supervision. If they're in a program called the Personal Care Services Program, plus the other hours that they may need, up to 283. And so it is possible for that reason to get protective supervision and paramedical services. The way it works here is that, I'm trying to think how to say this, basically you get what you need up to whatever the max is if you get protective supervision. Otherwise, you just get what you need. I hope that doesn't sound too strange, because let me see if I can explain this. If you get, let's say you need the maximum amount of hours in other services, let's see, to be severely impaired, you have to need 20 hours or more a month of personal care related services. So if you get under that, let's say you get 19.9, you need 19.9 hours per week of personal care related services, and so you're considered severely impaired. The max is still under 195 once you calculate it. So I just don't want people to get too hung up on this. What you really need to know is that if you get protective supervision and you're not severely impaired, you get 195 at least. And if you are severely impaired, you get 283. Otherwise, you get what you need and all the other services combined up to 283. I hope I said that correctly. Anyway, I'll put myself back on mute.
Okay, and one quick follow-up to that, Crystal, I think that's the last question we'll be able to get to. The person was asking, so if we already get max IHSS, is there any reason to apply for WPCS? Yes, but I'll turn that over to Crystal and Denise.
Yeah, I would, yes, again, because WPCS can be an add-on to IHSS. And like I said, kind of in the overtime exemption example, you could receive up to 12 hours a day or 360 hours a month of IHSS and WPCS combined.
Okay, thank you. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Denise and Crystal for sharing all this really important information and sharing your expertise. I don't know, Crystal or Denise, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we sign off?
No, I'd just say thank you. And if for some reason we didn't get to your question or you still have more questions, call us at Disability Rights California, and we had our intake information, or you can Google us.
And this is Crystal. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. And, you know, as Denise said, you know, if you guys need help, don't forget to request your hearing, please, and call us up for help. Thank you.
Thank you.